Just a quick question. Are you using a seasonally adjusted CPI or non-seasonal?
Seasonally adjusted CPI?
Yes.
Um, the answer would be yes.
You are using seasonally adjusted? Yes. Okay. And you had said earlier that if the CPI is negative or goes down, that the wage would not go down. At the most, it would just stay flat.
Right. The minimum, if the CPI were to go down, the level would stay flat. Yes.
Okay. There have been instances in history going back into the 30s and 40s where we've had a 10% decrease. But you're saying that even though there would be a decrease to that magnitude, that the wages would still stay at the same level.
How much? I would, could you repeat your question one more time?
Sure. There have been times in history, the most egregious in the 30s and 40s, where 1932, there was a 10% decrease from one year to the next, which if we let wages flow with the natural course of business, those wages would have gone down. Now you're saying that we would be stepping in and putting a floor, so when the CPI goes down, the wages wouldn't go down.
Well, let me just say this, and I think I want to take issue with you in terms of what you're saying. Even with the recession, the CPI has not gone up more than 3.5%.
In this particular
in the modern era, I guess.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, there's been other ones.
Well, and you're talking, and it's interesting that you're talking about the 30s, because minimum wage was established in 1938, and it was basically established for the United States of America was just coming out of the throes of the Depression.
Right. So with businesses,
we need to establish a living wage, if you will.
Right. And if the minimum wage was in effect in 1932 and the CPI went down 10%, those businesses that were, in the middle of a market crash wouldn't have been able to adjust their wages down. They would have had to maintain those wages. So that begs the question, what would have unemployment been like if we had that in place in 1932?
Well, those businesses were out of business. I mean, they went out of business without the minimum wage. And in fact, businesses have thrived with the minimum wage. Every time in recent history, let's talk recent history. In recent history, every time the minimum wage has gone up, our businesses have thrived.
Well, we'll get to that part. Anyway,
okay.
Next question. Would there be any revisions to the minimum wage when there are revisions to the CPI?
Yes.
Okay, so how is this going to work? So January comes along, the CPI comes out as of December. We peg the minimum wage to that number. In February, they come out with the revision. So now what happens? Are we going back now and changing the minimum wage?
Well, it depends what the number is, I guess. I mean, if it goes, as I said, if it goes down, it is tied to the rate of inflation.
Right. So, right. But the point is, we're looking at inflation at a particular point in time, but we're changing that a month later because all of these indices have revisions.
We're using a widely accepted index, and
right.
When it's changed at the federal level, it will be adjusted thereafter.
Okay, but how will that impact our minimum wage? Are employers going to have to go back and change what they pay their workers if we go back a month after the fact and revise?
And the answer would be no, it would be prospective.
Okay, so whatever number they come out with in January, that's the number that goes. Okay. What if that number is, oh wait.
I'm okay.
What if that number is dramatically higher than the year before? Do we have any provisions in this bill to moderate
and I
if
understand,
there's a dramatic increase?
Assemblywoman, I understand your question wholeheartedly. But in the last 30 years, it has not risen more than 3.5%.
Okay.
So I'm just dealing with recent history.
All right, well, let's talk.
Relatively recent.
Okay, let's go to recent history. Let's go back to when I was in high school, which was just the other day.
That was yesterday, wasn't
That's
it? Yeah.
right. That's right. Back in 1980, it was an increase of 12.5%. So from one year to the next, it was 12.5. The year before that, it was 13.3. That was my freshman year in high school, by the way.
Say it again. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
1981, when I was a junior learning how to drive, it was 9%. Let's see, let's go even sooner. Let's go to 1990. That's when I had my first child. Let's see, that's 6.1%. Okay, and 6.1% is very interesting because I know we've been talking a lot in these last couple of days here in the legislature about the impact that a 6% cut has on a budget line as it pertains to a particular community. What is it like for a business to suddenly have a 6% cut, if you will, in their labor component of their business?
Well, you know, it's a predictable. So you're asking me what the effect will be on business? Is that what you're
Right.
asking?
My point is that the numbers can change dramatically from one year to the next. We haven't seen that in recent years, but this has been a rather unique situation these recent years as well. There are times in our history, and not that far back in time, where we've had dramatic increases in the CPI from year to year. And from what I can see, there is no, or what you're saying is there's no provision in this bill that would help moderate that or smooth it, if you will. Is that correct?
Moderate. Well, let me just say this. You know, for the most part, they have smarter people than I that track these things. They track them all year long. It won't be any sudden sudden impacts. I mean, these are things that are predictable and they're tracked. So, and I don't foresee businesses being hurt by a sudden increase in the consumer price.
Well, if it goes up 12%, I think certainly it would.
And as I said, in recent history, in the last 30 years, it has not been that dramatic.
Well,
And let me just say this, Ms. Corwin, you know, we have 19 states that have a higher minimum wage than we have here in the state of New York. And quite possibly, New York might be the most expensive state to live in, arguably, in the United States of America. So, and it hasn't hurt those 19 states,
right.
and I think New York should certainly follow suit.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Wright. Thank you for your time. On the bill, Mr. Speaker. On the bill, Mr. Speaker.
On the bill, Ms. Corwin.
Thank you very much. An interesting document is put out by the federal government. It's by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it points out, it says how to use the Consumer Price Index for escalation. It's on the website. It's for anyone to look at. It has 6 points that should be followed when you're trying to tie some sort of obligation to an escalation factor or to CPI. One of those provisions says that you should provide a built-in method for handling situations that may arise because of major CPI revisions or changes in the CPI index. Now, from my understanding of this bill does not accommodate that. So what potentially could happen is we could have an instance where we go from year to year, we could have a 12 or 13 or 14% increase in the CPI, which would automatically translate into a dramatic increase in minimum wage, which for larger companies, maybe they'd be able to accommodate that. But for small businesses, I think that would be very, very detrimental. And interestingly, too, if you look at the annual inflation by decade, you look at the 70s, we had an average of 7%. In the 80s, we had an average of 5.5%. And if you look at that's the average inflation rate. If you look at the cumulative inflation rate by decade, in the 70s, we had a 102.9% increase in inflation, which means every dollar that was put in there was increased by 102%. So I think it's very, very important for us to keep in mind that while we haven't had a problem with inflation in recent years, we certainly have had that happen in our history in the past. And if you look at what's happening at the federal level right now, we have the Federal Reserve, which is intentionally keeping rates down, which is intentionally keeping inflation down. It's not going to stay that way forever. And if you watch CNBC at all, I try to watch it every day, across all spectrums, you'll see economists talking about the concern for inflation coming in the next couple years when the Fed stops doing their QE, the quantitative easing. So for that, I am very concerned about what's going to happen to businesses if they suddenly are getting socked with a dramatic increase in minimum wage. I also have to just put a little 2 bits here about personal experience. We had a family business for 36 years, and it was our practice to hire summer help every summer. In fact, that was my first summer job, was working in the summer staff. My wage was $3.25 an hour, and I got the minimum like everybody else. But I'll tell you, it was the way it worked in our business, and I think other business owners will say the same thing. At the beginning of the year, you put together your budget, you allocate X number of dollars to be spent on summer staff, and whether you can get 10 people for that amount or 8 people for that amount, the number is set. So you can have 10 people have a job who were in high school level. We were able to get work experience, put that on our resumes, help us to move up the ladder. Or you can have 2 of those people who wouldn't have that opportunity. So the summer help absolutely, and I can tell you firsthand experience, is impacted by this. And to be very mindful of the impact this would have on kids who are trying to get their foot in the door, who are trying to get a start in life and need that basic entry-level work experience. The best way to help people, I believe, out of poverty is to get them a job, get them job training, and get them education. I think we do far more good for our people in the lower income brackets if we can help them to get a better education, better skills, better work experience, rather than trying to fudge this, which is probably going to just cause layoffs, much as it did when we had to deal with this issue back in the 70s. So thank you very much, Speaker.